The slap came out of nowhere, a crack like lightning splitting the air, and my head snapped to the side so hard I felt something pop in my neck as my body stumbled backward into the mahogany credenza that had belonged to my grandmother. The crystal vase on top wobbled dangerously before crashing to the hardwood floor, shattering into 1,000 glittering pieces that scattered across my entryway like fallen stars. And through the ringing in my ears, I heard Veronica screaming at me with a fury that seemed to radiate from her entire body like heat waves off summer pavement. "Give me those keys right now, you selfish old hag!" she shrieked, her perfectly manicured hand still raised as if she might strike me again. Her face contorted into something ugly and unrecognizable. Nothing like the sweet smile she had worn when my son Brandon first brought her home 3 years ago. "This house is wasted on you. You're just one pathetic old woman rattling around in all this space, while Brandon and I are crammed into that tiny apartment, and it's not fair. It's not right. And I'm done asking nicely." Her voice had risen to a pitch that was almost inhuman, echoing off the high ceilings of the foyer, and I could see spittle flying from her lips as she advanced on me, her designer heels clicking ominously on the floor that I had just had refinished last month. Behind her, framed in the doorway with the late afternoon sun creating a halo effect around his silhouette, stood Brandon, my only child, the boy I had carried for 9 months and raised alone after his father Marcus died when he was just 7 years old, and he was looking at me with an expression I had never seen before, something cold and calculating and completely devoid of the love I thought we shared. "Mom, just give Veronica the keys," he said quietly, his voice carrying that patronizing tone people use when they're trying to sound reasonable while asking you to do something completely unreasonable. "We've talked about this 100 times. You're 65 years old. You shouldn't be living alone in a house this size. What if you fall? What if you have a medical emergency and no one finds you for days? We're just trying to look out for you." The words were supposedly caring, but the delivery was flat, rehearsed, like he had practiced this speech in front of a mirror, and I felt something inside me crack, not from the physical pain of Veronica's slap, though my cheek was burning like someone had pressed a hot iron against it, but from the emotional devastation of realizing that my son, my beautiful boy who I had sacrificed everything for, had just stood there and watched his wife assault me without lifting a finger to defend me. For 18 months, I had endured Veronica's increasingly aggressive suggestions that I downsize, that I move into a retirement community, that I sell this house that Marcus and I had bought when Brandon was just a baby. The house where we had celebrated birthdays and holidays, where we had weathered storms both literal and metaphorical, where Marcus had taken his last breath while holding my hand and telling me to be strong for our son. This house wasn't just property. It wasn't just square footage and market value. It was my life, my memories, my connection to the man I had loved more than anything in this world. And they wanted me to hand it over like it meant nothing, like I meant nothing. "Get out," I said, my voice coming out stronger than I expected, cutting through Veronica's continued tirade about fairness and need and how she deserved better than what life had given her. "Get out of my house right now, both of you." Veronica laughed, actually threw her head back and laughed like I had told the funniest joke she had ever heard. "Your house? Oh, Cassandra, you poor deluded woman. This isn't going to be your house much longer. Brandon and I have already consulted with lawyers about having you declared incompetent. We have documentation, recordings, witness statements, everything we need to prove you can't manage your own affairs anymore." She pulled her phone from her designer purse and waved it at me triumphantly. "Every time you forgot where you put your reading glasses. Every time you asked us to repeat something, every time you seemed even slightly confused, I recorded it. I have videos, I have audio files, I have dates and timestamps, and I have 3 different lawyers who all say we have an excellent case. The calculated cruelty of it, the premeditated nature of her campaign against me, hit me like a physical blow. And I had to grab the wall to keep from falling because my legs suddenly felt like they couldn't support my weight. This wasn't a spontaneous outburst. This wasn't even just about wanting my house. This was a systematic, carefully planned attack that had been in motion for months, maybe longer. And I had been too trusting, too blind, too desperate to believe in the goodness of my own son to see it coming. Brandon finally stepped fully into the house, pulling the door closed behind him with a soft click that somehow sounded ominous in the charged atmosphere. And he moved to stand beside Veronica with a united front that made my stomach turn because I could see now that this had always been their plan, that they had discussed this moment, rehearsed it, decided together that today was the day they would corner me and demand my surrender. "Mom, you're making this harder than it needs to be," Brandon said with that same false patience that was starting to make my blood boil, despite the shock and pain radiating through my entire body. "Veronica and I aren't the bad guys here. We're trying to help you transition into a more appropriate living situation for someone your age. We've already looked at several really nice assisted living facilities, places with activities and medical staff, and other people your age to socialize with." His words painted a picture of concerned children trying to care for an aging parent, but I could hear the manipulation underneath, the carefully chosen phrases designed to make me sound incompetent, to make their actions sound reasonable and loving, instead of the predatory scheme they actually were. Comment below where you are watching this from and what time it is right now. The reality of my situation was crystallizing with horrifying clarity as I stood there with my back literally against the wall, feeling the cool plaster through my thin cardigan. And I understood that everything I had noticed over the past year and a half, all the little warning signs I had dismissed because I didn't want to believe my own son could betray me, had been pieces of a larger picture I had refused to see. I remembered Veronica's questions about my will 6 months after she and Brandon got married. Casual inquiries over dinner about whether I had updated my estate planning, whether I had a trust, whether Brandon was listed as my power of attorney. I remembered the real estate agent who had knocked on my door 8 months ago, saying someone in the neighborhood had recommended he contact me about selling because I might be interested in downsizing. And when I asked who had given him my information, he had checked his notes and said it was a young woman named Veronica Chen who said she was family. I remembered the afternoon 4 months ago when I came home from my volunteer shift at the library to find Brandon in my office going through my filing cabinet. And when I asked what he was doing, he said he was just looking for some old photos. But now I realized he had been searching for financial documents, for property deeds, for anything he could use to build his case against me. Every memory was clicking into place like tumblers in a lock, revealing the true mechanism of their deception. And I felt anger beginning to replace the shock, a hot, burning fury that started in my chest and spread through my limbs like molten lava. "You want this house so badly?" I asked, straightening up and meeting Veronica's eyes directly, seeing the greed there naked and unashamed. "You think I'm just some confused old woman you can push around and manipulate and steal from?" Veronica's expression shifted slightly, uncertainty flickering across her features for just a moment before the aggressive certainty returned. "We're not stealing anything, Cassandra. We're helping you before you hurt yourself or lose everything because you're too stubborn to admit you need help." She stepped closer, invading my personal space in a way that was clearly meant to intimidate. "Look at you. You can't even stand up straight. You're trembling. You probably haven't eaten properly in days because you forget to cook for yourself. This is exactly why you need supervision, why you need to be somewhere safe where people can take care of you." Her words were designed to make me doubt myself, to plant seeds of uncertainty about my own competence, and I realized this was exactly what she had been doing for months, undermining my confidence, questioning my decisions, making me second-guess every little thing until I started to wonder if maybe she was right, if maybe I was losing my edge. But standing there, with my cheeks still burning from her slap, and my grandmother's vase destroyed on the floor, I felt a clarity I hadn't experienced in over a year, and I understood with perfect certainty that I had been gaslit, manipulated, psychologically abused by someone I had welcomed into my family with open arms. "I want both of you out of my house in the next 60 seconds, or I'm calling the police," I said, pulling my phone from my pocket and holding it up so they could see I was serious. "You've assaulted me, you've threatened me, you've admitted to a conspiracy to defraud me of my property, and every word of this conversation has been recorded." I pointed to the small camera mounted discreetly in the corner of the foyer, part of the security system Marcus had insisted we install 15 years ago after a series of break-ins in the neighborhood, a system I had kept active and updated even though Veronica had repeatedly suggested I didn't need it anymore. The color drained from Veronica's face so rapidly, she looked like she might actually faint, and she spun around to stare at the camera with an expression of absolute horror, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. And I felt a grim satisfaction watching her realize that her carefully constructed scheme had just collapsed around her. "You've been recording us?" Brandon asked, his voice rising with a mixture of anger and panic. "Mom, you can't just record people without their permission. That's illegal." His attempt to turn this around, to make me the villain in this situation, would have been laughable if it wasn't so desperately sad, watching my son scramble for any foothold in an argument he had already lost. "Actually, Brandon, in this state, I absolutely can record anyone in my own home without their knowledge or consent," I replied, my voice steady now, growing stronger with each word as I watched their confidence crumble. "It's called single-party consent, and your father taught me all about it when he was still practicing law. He also taught me about elder abuse statutes, about undue influence, about conspiracy to commit fraud, and about exactly what kind of evidence I would need if anyone ever tried to take advantage of me." The truth was, I had suspected something was wrong for the past 6 months, ever since I overheard Veronica on the phone with someone, probably her sister, talking about how the old bat was putting up more resistance than expected, but that they just needed to be patient and keep up the pressure. That conversation had woken me up from the fog of trust I had been living in, and I had immediately contacted Nathaniel Rodriguez, Marcus's former law partner and one of my oldest friends, who had helped me understand exactly what Veronica and Brandon were attempting and exactly how to protect myself. Nathaniel had been the one who suggested I upgrade my security system to include audio recording, who had helped me document every interaction with Veronica and Brandon over the past months, who had hired a private investigator to look into Veronica's background and discovered things that made my blood run cold. "Mom, please, let's just calm down and talk about this rationally," Brandon said, switching tactics now, his voice taking on a pleading quality that might have worked on me a year ago, but that now just sounded pathetic and manipulative. "I know Veronica came on a little strong, and maybe the slap was out of line, but we're all family here. We can work this out without involving lawyers or police or making this into some big dramatic thing." His words revealed so much about how he saw the situation. How he thought he could minimize Veronica's assault as coming on a little strong. How he believed I would just forgive and forget if he used the right tone of voice. And I marveled at how much I had failed him as a parent if he had grown into someone who thought this kind of behavior was acceptable. Family doesn't assault each other, I said quietly, touching my cheek where I could feel swelling starting to form. Family doesn't conspire to steal from each other. Family doesn't gaslight and manipulate and try to have their own mother declared incompetent so they can steal her home. You stopped being my family the moment you stood there and watched your wife hit me without saying a word to defend me. Brandon flinched as if I had slapped him, and I saw something flicker in his eyes that might have been genuine remorse, but Veronica grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the door with a venomous glare in my direction. "Fine, we'll leave, but this isn't over, Cassandra," she hissed, her mask of civility completely abandoned now. "We have lawyers too, and we have documentation. And we're going to make sure everyone knows that you're an unstable old woman who attacked your own son and his wife because you're too senile to know what you're doing anymore." Her threat was so transparent, so obviously desperate, that I almost felt sorry for her, almost pitied this woman who had built her entire strategy on my supposed weakness and was now discovering that she had drastically underestimated her opponent. "Go ahead and try," I replied calmly. "I'm sure Judge Patricia Morrison would be very interested to hear your version of events, especially since she's been a close friend of mine for 20 years and she specializes in elder abuse cases." The name drop was intentional, and I watched Veronica's face go even paler as she realized I wasn't just some isolated old woman with no resources or connections, that I had been married to a prominent attorney for 30 years and had maintained all those professional relationships even after Marcus's death. Brandon was pulling at Veronica now, clearly wanting to get out before the situation deteriorated further, and as they stumbled toward the door, I called out one more thing. "Brandon, your father loved you more than life itself, and he worked himself to exhaustion to provide for us, to give you every opportunity, to make sure you grew up to be a good man with integrity and honor. If he could see you now, see what you've become, see how you've treated the woman he loved, it would break his heart." My words hit their target, and Brandon's face crumpled, tears beginning to stream down his cheeks. But Veronica yanked him out the door before he could respond, and then they were gone. The door slamming behind them hard enough to rattle the windows. I stood in the sudden silence of my foyer, surrounded by the shattered remains of my grandmother's vase, my cheek throbbing, my hands shaking with the aftershocks of adrenaline, and I finally allowed myself to sink down onto the bottom step of the staircase where I had sat countless times over the years, waiting for Marcus to come home from work or for Brandon to come downstairs for breakfast when he was a teenager. The reality of what had just happened crashed over me like a wave, and I buried my face in my hands and cried, not quiet tears, but great heaving sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep in my soul, mourning not just the confrontation that had occurred, but the death of the relationship I thought I had with my son, the death of my illusions about who he had become, the death of the fantasy that family would always protect you and love you and have your best interests at heart. I cried for Marcus, who had died believing his son would take care of me, who had never seen the selfishness and greed that had apparently always been lurking under Brandon's surface, waiting for the right catalyst to bring it out. I cried for the grandmother's vase that had survived 3 generations only to be destroyed in a moment of violence. I cried for the version of Brandon who had existed only in my memories, the sweet boy who brought me dandelions and told me I was the best mother in the world because that boy was gone, replaced by someone I didn't recognize and wasn't sure I even liked. After about 20 minutes, I pulled myself together enough to call Nathaniel, my hands still trembling as I dialed his number. And he picked up on the second ring with his usual professional greeting that shifted to concern the moment he heard my voice. "Cassandra, what happened? You sound terrible." I walked him through the entire confrontation while simultaneously going to the kitchen to get ice for my swelling cheek, describing Veronica's assault, Brandon's complicity, their threats about the competency proceedings, and my revelation about the security cameras. Nathaniel listened without interrupting, and I could hear him typing notes on his computer as I spoke, his lawyer brain already organizing the information and formulating a strategy. "First things first, you need to go to the hospital right now and get that cheek examined and photographed for documentation," he said firmly when I finished. "Physical evidence of assault is crucial, and we want medical records showing exactly what happened and when. Then you need to file a police report. I know Brandon is your son, but this has crossed the line from family dispute into criminal behavior, and we need to establish that in the official record." His words made sense logically, but emotionally I was struggling with the idea of pressing charges against my own child, of potentially seeing him arrested and prosecuted, of making this breach in our relationship permanent and public. "Nathaniel, I don't know if I can do that," I said quietly, pressing the ice pack against my face and wincing at the cold. "He's still my son. Maybe if I just make it clear that I'm not going to be pushed around, they'll back off and we can find some way to work through this." There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Nathaniel responded, and when he did, his voice was gentle but firm in the way that reminded me so much of Marcus. "Cassandra, I've known you for 32 years, and I loved Marcus like a brother, and I'm telling you this as your friend, not as your lawyer. You cannot let this slide. What Veronica and Brandon did today wasn't a one-time mistake or a moment of bad judgment. It was the culmination of months of planning and manipulation, and if you don't establish consequences now, they will see it as permission to escalate. They will continue to harass you, to undermine you, to work toward their goal of taking your home and your independence. And next time, they might be smarter about avoiding cameras." His words resonated with the part of me that knew he was right, that knew protecting Brandon from the consequences of his actions would be the worst thing I could do for him. That real love sometimes meant allowing people to face the results of their choices. "What did the private investigator find out about Veronica?" I asked, changing the subject slightly because I wasn't ready to commit to filing charges yet. "You said there were things in her background that I should know about." Nathaniel's sigh was audible through the phone. "Cassandra? Veronica Chen isn't who she claimed to be. Her real name is Veronica Castellanos, and she changed it legally 4 years ago after her previous marriage ended in a restraining order and a fraud investigation. Her ex-husband's family owned a chain of dry cleaning businesses, and Veronica systematically worked to isolate him from his parents, convinced him they needed to take over the family business, and then attempted to have his father declared incompetent so they could gain control of the company assets." The information Nathaniel was sharing felt surreal, like something from a television crime drama rather than my actual life, and I sank into one of my kitchen chairs as he continued laying out the details of Veronica's past, each revelation more disturbing than the last. The ex-husband, his name is Marcus Chen, ironically enough, finally realized what was happening when Veronica tried to get him to sign documents that would have transferred his father's properties into their names. And when he refused and started asking questions, she escalated to claiming his father was mentally unfit and needed to be placed in a care facility, Nathaniel explained, and I could hear papers rustling as he referenced his notes. The family hired investigators, discovered the extent of her manipulation and fraud, and confronted her with evidence. She agreed to a quiet divorce and name change in exchange for them not pressing criminal charges. But Marcus Chen's father insisted on a restraining order that's still in effect, prohibiting her from coming within 500 feet of any family member or any of their business properties. I felt sick listening to this, understanding that my son had married a woman with a documented history of exactly what she was now attempting to do to me, and wondering how Brandon could have been so blind, so foolish, so willing to participate in this scheme. Did Brandon know about any of this when he married her? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. The private investigator spoke with several of Veronica's former friends and associates, and the consensus is that she's very good at reinventing herself, at creating a believable backstory, at presenting exactly the image that will appeal to her target. Nathaniel said carefully. It's likely Brandon knows nothing about her real history, that she told him whatever story would make her seem sympathetic and trustworthy, and that she's been manipulating him just as much as she's been manipulating you, albeit in different ways. The thought that Brandon might be as much a victim as a perpetrator was complicated because he was still an adult who had made choices, who had stood by while his wife assaulted his mother, who had participated in the scheme to steal my home. But it also explained some things about how he had changed over the past 3 years. How the sweet, if sometimes selfish boy I had raised had transformed into someone capable of such cruelty. Nathaniel, what do I do? I asked, feeling overwhelmed by the magnitude of the situation, by the complexity of my emotions, by the weight of decisions that would have permanent consequences. How do I protect myself without completely destroying my relationship with my son? His response was immediate and unequivocal. You protect yourself first, Cassandra. You establish legal boundaries, you document everything, you press charges for the assault, and you make it crystal clear that their behavior will not be tolerated. Whether your relationship with Brandon can be salvaged depends entirely on whether he's willing to leave Veronica, acknowledge what he's done, and put in the hard work of rebuilding trust. And those are decisions he has to make, not decisions you can make for him. I knew he was right. Knew that enabling Brandon's bad behavior would help no one. But the maternal part of me that had spent 38 years protecting and nurturing my son was screaming that there had to be another way, that I couldn't just write him off, that family was supposed to forgive and work through problems. I need some time to think, I told Nathaniel, though even as I said it, I knew what I was going to do, what I had to do. Can you send me everything the investigator found on Veronica? I want to see it all, understand exactly who my son married. We talked for a few more minutes about logistics and next steps, and then I hung up and sat in my kitchen where Marcus and I had shared thousands of meals and conversations, where Brandon had done his homework at this very table, where we had celebrated birthdays and holidays and ordinary Tuesdays, and I felt the weight of all those memories pressing down on me. My phone buzzed with a text message, and when I looked at the screen, I saw it was from Brandon. Just 3 words that felt like a knife twisting in my chest. Mom, I'm sorry. I stared at those words for a long time, trying to determine if they represented genuine remorse or just another manipulation tactic, whether Brandon was truly apologizing for what had happened or just sorry that their plan had failed. And I realized I couldn't tell anymore, that the trust between us had been so thoroughly destroyed that I questioned everything he said and did. I typed out and deleted a dozen responses before finally settling on something that felt true. If you're really sorry, leave Veronica and get yourself into therapy to figure out how you became someone who could do what you did today. Until then, we have nothing to say to each other. His response came almost immediately. I can't leave her, Mom. I love her. And you're wrong about her, about all of this. When you calm down and think rationally, you'll see we were just trying to help." The message confirmed what I had suspected, that Brandon was either so deeply under Veronica's influence that he couldn't see reality anymore, or that he was willfully choosing to believe her lies, because facing the truth would be too painful. The next morning, I woke up with my face swollen and bruised, the imprint of Veronica's hand visible in purple and yellow across my cheek, and I took careful photographs with my phone from multiple angles, documenting the evidence of assault with the meticulous attention to detail that Marcus had always insisted was crucial in legal matters. I got dressed in a simple navy blue pantsuit that Marcus had always said made me look professional and capable, applied minimal makeup that didn't hide the bruising, and drove myself to the emergency room at St. Catherine's Hospital, where I had been a volunteer for the past decade. Dr. Sarah Kim was on duty, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who had always been friendly during my volunteer shifts. And when she saw my face, her expression shifted from professional concern to personal outrage. "Cassandra, what happened to you?" she asked, gently examining my cheek with practiced fingers, and I saw genuine anger in her eyes when I explained that my daughter-in-law had slapped me during an argument. "This is assault, and it needs to be documented and reported. I'm going to take photographs, do a full examination, and I'm mandated to file a report with Adult Protective Services because you're over 65. She was thorough and compassionate, asking detailed questions about the incident, about whether I felt safe in my home, about whether this was the first time something like this had happened. And I found myself telling her more than I had intended, describing the months of manipulation and the conspiracy to have me declared incompetent. Dr. Kim's expression grew progressively darker as I spoke, and when I finished, she said something that surprised me. "Cassandra, I see cases like yours more often than you'd think. Adult children who view their aging parents as obstacles to be overcome, rather than people to be respected, and it makes me sick every single time. You're doing the right thing by documenting this and standing up for yourself, and I want you to know that you have support, that you're not alone in this fight." Her words brought tears to my eyes, and I realized how isolated I had felt over the past months, how Veronica had systematically worked to distance me from friends and social connections, suggesting that I was too tired for book club, too busy for volunteer work, too overwhelmed to maintain friendships, until my world had shrunk to just my house and my increasingly strained relationship with Brandon. After leaving the hospital with copies of all the medical documentation, I drove to the police station and filed a formal report for assault and battery, sitting across from Officer Marcus Thompson, another unfortunate coincidence of names that made my heart ache, and walking him through the entire incident while he took notes with patient attention to detail. "Ma'am, I want you to understand that filing charges against family members often leads to complicated situations," Officer Thompson said gently when I finished giving my statement. "Are you certain you want to pursue this? Once the wheels are in motion, it's difficult to stop the process." His question was well-intentioned, giving me an out if I wanted it, but I thought about Dr. Kim's words about adult children viewing their parents as obstacles, about Nathaniel's warning that letting this slide would only encourage escalation, about Marcus's voice in my memory insisting that accountability mattered. "I'm certain," I said firmly. "What happened wasn't a family dispute that got out of hand. It was assault in furtherance of a conspiracy to commit fraud, and I want it treated as the crime it is." Officer Thompson nodded approvingly and continued with his report. And by the time I left the police station 2 hours later, the wheels of justice were officially in motion, and there was no going back. Over the next week, things moved faster than I had anticipated, with detectives from the Elder Abuse Unit contacting me to conduct a more detailed investigation, with Veronica and Brandon being served with restraining orders prohibiting them from coming within 200 feet of me or my property, and with the district attorney's office indicating they were seriously considering pressing charges. Nathaniel sent over the complete investigator's report on Veronica, and reading through it was like watching a horror movie unfold in documentary form. Seeing the pattern of her behavior across multiple relationships, the way she targeted men with assets or family wealth, the systematic approach she took to isolating them from support systems and manipulating them toward her goals. There were interviews with her ex-husband, Marcus Chen, who described with painful clarity how Veronica had transformed him from a confident, successful businessman into an anxious shell of himself, constantly questioning his own judgment, believing he was lucky that someone like her would tolerate someone as inadequate as him. There were statements from former friends who had tried to warn him and been cut off, from family members who had seen through her act and been painted as enemies, from business associates who had noticed the gradual changes in his behavior and personality. Reading Marcus Chen's account of his marriage to Veronica was like looking into a mirror that reflected my son's experience, and I could see exactly how she had used the same playbook on Brandon, the same tactics of isolation and manipulation, the same gradual erosion of his identity until he became an extension of her will rather than his own person. Marcus Chen had agreed to a phone call with me, facilitated by the investigator, and talking to him was both illuminating and heartbreaking as he described the years it had taken him to recover from Veronica's psychological abuse, the therapy he had needed to rebuild his sense of self, the trust issues that still plagued his relationships. "Mrs. Hartwell, I want you to understand something important," Marcus Chen said to me during that conversation, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "Your son isn't a bad person who made bad choices. He's a victim of a predator who is very, very good at what she does. Veronica identifies vulnerabilities and exploits them with surgical precision, and once she has her hooks in someone, they genuinely cannot see reality clearly anymore." His words offered some comfort regarding Brandon's behavior, but they also terrified me because if Veronica's hold on my son was that strong, how would he ever break free? And what would happen to him when she inevitably moved on to her next target, as Marcus Chen assured me she would once she realized I wasn't going to be the easy mark she had expected. "What finally made you see the truth?" I asked Marcus Chen, desperate for some insight into how I might reach Brandon before it was too late. "My father had a stroke," he replied quietly. "Veronica saw it as an opportunity to accelerate her plans, pushing me to have him declared incompetent while he was in the hospital, bringing me papers to sign that would have transferred his assets. But my sister flew in from Seattle, and she sat me down and literally wouldn't let me leave the room until I listened to everything she had been trying to tell me for months. She had documentation, evidence, recordings of Veronica saying things she thought no one else would hear, and seeing it all laid out objectively, I couldn't maintain the delusion anymore. The parallel to my own situation was obvious, and I wondered if Brandon would need a similar moment of undeniable clarity. If perhaps the restraining orders and the police investigation and the consequences that were starting to pile up might serve the same purpose that Marcus Chen's sister's intervention had served for him. 10 days after the assault, I received a call from Detective Jennifer Walsh from the Elder Abuse Unit, asking if she could come to my house to discuss the investigation. And when she arrived that afternoon with her partner, Detective Robert Chang, both of them had expressions that suggested significant developments. "Mrs. Hartwell, we've been conducting a thorough investigation into Veronica Castellanos and her activities over the past 3 years, and we've uncovered evidence of multiple instances of fraud, forgery, and conspiracy," Detective Walsh began, settling into my living room with a thick folder of documents. "We have recordings of conversations between Veronica and her sister discussing the timeline for gaining control of your assets. We have evidence of forged documents purporting to show your mental incompetence. We have witness statements from people she attempted to recruit into providing false testimony about your cognitive state. And we have her previous history with Marcus Chen's family that establishes a clear pattern of elder financial abuse. Detective Chang added, "We also executed a search warrant on the apartment your son shares with Veronica, and we found extensive files on you, your property, your finances, and detailed plans for what they intended to do once they gained control of your estate, including immediate sale of this house and placement of you in the least expensive care facility they could find while they used the proceeds to pay off their substantial debts. The casual cruelty of their plans, laid out in black and white with no consideration for me as a human being, with feelings and rights and a lifetime of memories tied to this house, made me feel physically ill, and I had to take several deep breaths before I could respond. "Where is Brandon now?" I asked, because despite everything, he was still my son, and I needed to know he was okay, even if he had participated in trying to destroy me. "He's cooperating with the investigation," Detective Walsh said carefully. "After we executed the search warrant and showed him the evidence we'd found, including documents in Veronica's handwriting that made it clear she viewed him as a useful tool rather than a partner, he broke down and admitted to everything: his role in the conspiracy, the months of manipulation, the plan to have you declared incompetent. He's agreed to testify against Veronica in exchange for a plea deal on reduced charges." The news that Brandon had finally seen the truth should have brought me relief, but instead, I felt a deep sadness for the price he had paid to learn this lesson, for the years he had wasted with someone who never truly cared about him, for the relationship with his mother that he had damaged perhaps beyond repair. Detective Walsh explained that Brandon had been staying at a friend's apartment since the search warrant execution, that he had already filed for divorce from Veronica, and that he had been asking repeatedly if he could speak to me, if I would be willing to hear his apology, if there was any chance I could forgive him. "That's entirely your decision, Mrs. Hartwell," Detective Walsh said gently. "You're under no obligation to have contact with him, especially while the criminal investigation is ongoing, but I wanted you to know that his remorse appears genuine, and the therapist we connected him with believes he's been a victim of sustained psychological abuse that significantly impaired his judgment." The complexity of my emotions regarding Brandon was almost overwhelming, because I was simultaneously furious at him for his betrayal, heartbroken for the abuse he had suffered, relieved that he had finally escaped Veronica's influence, and terrified that the damage to our relationship might be permanent. "I'm not ready to see him yet," I told the detectives, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. "Maybe someday, after there's been time and healing, and he's proven through actions rather than words that he's changed. But right now, the wound is too fresh, the trust too broken." Detective Chang nodded with understanding. "That's completely reasonable, Mrs. Hartwell. Take all the time you need. Brandon is getting the help he needs, and when and if you're ready to reconnect, that opportunity will be there." After the detectives left, I sat in Marcus's study, surrounded by his law books and the photographs of our life together. And I talked to him the way I had been doing since he died, asking him what I should do, whether I was being too harsh on Brandon or not harsh enough, whether Marcus would be disappointed in how I had handled everything. The arrest came 2 days later, with Veronica being charged with elder abuse, conspiracy to commit fraud, assault and battery, and multiple counts of forgery related to the false documents she had created to support the competency proceedings. The news coverage was extensive, with local television stations running stories about the sophisticated elder abuse scheme, and my phone rang constantly with calls from friends I hadn't heard from in months, neighbors expressing their support, and even strangers who had seen the news and wanted to share their own stories of family financial abuse. Pauline from next door brought over a casserole and stayed for 3 hours, and I learned that Veronica had approached her 6 months earlier, asking questions about my mental state, whether she had noticed me acting confused or forgetful, whether she thought I was capable of living alone. I told her you were sharper than most people half your age, and that she should be grateful to have such a capable mother-in-law, Pauline said indignantly. She didn't like that answer at all, got quite huffy and left. I should have warned you then, Cassandra, but I thought it was just typical daughter-in-law, mother-in-law friction, not this. Her guilt was palpable, but I assured her that Veronica had been very skilled at hiding her true nature, that even I hadn't seen it clearly until it was almost too late. That no one should blame themselves for being deceived by a professional manipulator. The trial was scheduled for 4 months later, and in the interim, I found myself slowly rebuilding the life that had been diminished by Veronica's systematic isolation tactics, rejoining my book club, resuming my volunteer work at the hospital, reconnecting with friends I had drifted away from, and reclaiming my sense of self that had been eroded by months of gaslighting and manipulation. Nathaniel kept me updated on the legal proceedings, explaining that Veronica's defense attorney was trying to paint her as a concerned daughter-in-law whose actions had been misinterpreted, but that the evidence was so overwhelming, the pattern of behavior so clear, that even her lawyer seemed to know it was a losing battle. The district attorney is offering her a plea deal, 5 years in prison with possibility of parole after 3, in exchange for her guilty plea and agreement not to appeal, Nathaniel told me during one of our regular update calls. If she refuses and we go to trial, she's looking at potentially 15 to 20 years given the multiple charges and her previous history with the Chen family. I felt no satisfaction in Veronica's legal troubles, only a deep weariness with the whole situation and a desire for it to be over, so I could move forward with my life. 3 months after the assault, I received a letter from Brandon, delivered through Nathaniel to ensure I didn't have to have direct contact if I wasn't ready, and reading it was one of the most painful experiences of the entire ordeal. Brandon's letter was 12 pages long, handwritten in the careful script I had taught him when he was learning to write, and it detailed with devastating honesty the progression of his relationship with Veronica, how she had identified his vulnerabilities related to losing his father, how she had gradually isolated him from friends and family, how she had convinced him that her increasingly extreme suggestions about me were motivated by love and concern rather than greed and manipulation. He wrote about the moment during the search warrant execution when Detective Walsh had shown him documents in Veronica's handwriting describing him as a useful idiot who was serving his purpose but would be discarded once she had what she needed, and how that moment of clarity had been like waking up from a nightmare to discover the nightmare was real. He wrote about the therapy he had been attending 3 times a week, working to understand how he had allowed himself to be so completely controlled, processing the grief and anger and shame of recognizing how thoroughly he had betrayed his mother, the woman who had sacrificed everything to raise him after his father died. He wrote about the divorce proceedings, how Veronica had tried one last manipulation by claiming to be pregnant with his child, a lie that had been exposed when he demanded a pregnancy test, and how that final deception had killed whatever Ken Liu feelings he might have still had for her. And he wrote about his understanding that I might never be able to forgive him, that the relationship we had once shared might be gone forever, but that he wanted me to know he was committed to becoming someone worthy of forgiveness, even if that forgiveness never came. Someone his father would have been proud of instead of ashamed of. Someone who would spend the rest of his life trying to atone for the harm he had caused. Reading the letter brought tears I had been holding back for months, and I cried for the innocence we had both lost, for the years that had been stolen by Veronica's manipulation, for the long road of healing that stretched ahead of us both. I wrote back a much shorter letter that took me 3 days to compose, telling Brandon that I believed his remorse was genuine, that I understood he had been victimized by Veronica, even as he had participated in victimizing me. That I was willing to consider rebuilding our relationship, but that it would take time and consistent effort and proof through actions that he had truly changed. I told him that I loved him, that I had never stopped loving him, even when I was most hurt and angry. But that love alone wasn't enough to repair what had been broken. That trust had to be earned back slowly through demonstrated reliability and honesty and respect for boundaries. His response came within days, thanking me for being willing to give him a chance, promising that he would do whatever it took to prove himself worthy of my trust again, and asking if perhaps in a few months, when some of the acute pain had faded, we might be able to meet for coffee and start the slow process of reconnection. Veronica ultimately accepted the plea deal, unable to face the prospect of trial where all her manipulations and schemes would be laid bare for public consumption, and watching her being sentenced to 5 years in prison brought me no joy, only a grim relief that she would be unable to victimize anyone else for a while, and a hope that perhaps she would use that time to examine her own behavior and make different choices in the future, though Marcus Chen had warned me not to hold my breath on that score. 6 months after the assault, Brandon and I met for coffee at a small cafe halfway between our homes, and it was awkward and painful and hopeful all at once. Both of us fumbling for words, both of us carrying the weight of everything that had happened, both of us trying to find a way back to each other across the chasm that had opened between us. "Mom, I know I can't undo what I did, and I know that sorry doesn't even begin to cover the magnitude of how I hurt you," Brandon said, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup as if seeking warmth. "But I want you to know that I'm committed to doing the work, to being honest even when it's uncomfortable, to respecting your boundaries, to proving through my actions that I'm not that person anymore." I looked at my son, seeing the gray hairs that hadn't been there a year ago, the lines of stress and regret etched into his face, the humility that had replaced the arrogance that Veronica had cultivated in him, and I felt a cautious hope that maybe, with time and effort, we could build something new from the ruins of what had been destroyed. We met for coffee every 2 weeks for the next 6 months, gradually rebuilding trust through small, consistent actions, through Brandon following through on promises, through honest conversations about his therapy and his understanding of how he had been manipulated and how he had hurt me, through my slow journey toward forgiveness that was complicated and messy and nonlinear. Brandon got a new job, moved into a modest apartment that he could actually afford, and started living within his means rather than trying to maintain the unsustainable lifestyle that Veronica had demanded. And I watched him slowly become someone I recognized again, someone with the core values I had tried to instill in him as a child, someone his father would have been proud to know. We attended family therapy together, working through our hurt and anger and grief with the help of Dr. Elizabeth Morris, a skilled therapist who specialized in family reconciliation after abuse, and those sessions were brutally honest and often painful, but ultimately healing in ways I hadn't expected. 1 year after Veronica's slap, Brandon and I stood together at Marcus's grave, something we hadn't done together since the funeral 6 years earlier, and we talked to him about everything that had happened, about how close we had come to losing each other forever, about the long road of healing we had traveled, and about our commitment to honoring his memory by being better people than we had been. "Dad would have been so disappointed in me," Brandon said quietly, touching the headstone with gentle fingers. "He taught me to be honest, to have integrity, to treat people with respect, and I violated every one of those principles. But I'm trying to be someone he could be proud of again, Mom." I'm trying every single day." I squeezed his hand, feeling the fragile connection we had rebuilt, knowing it was still delicate, but growing stronger. "Your father would be proud of you for facing what you did wrong, for taking responsibility, for doing the hard work of changing, Brandon. That's what integrity actually means. Not being perfect, but being willing to acknowledge your mistakes and grow from them." The house that had been the center of so much conflict remained my sanctuary, and I filled it with the sounds of my book club meetings, with volunteer coordinator sessions for the hospital, with dinners for friends who had stood by me, with life and laughter and the knowledge that I had stood up for myself and survived. I used some of my savings to establish a foundation in Marcus's name dedicated to helping elderly victims of financial abuse, providing legal assistance and emotional support and education about warning signs and protective measures. And working with that foundation became one of the most meaningful parts of my life, turning my painful experience into something that could help others. Brandon became a volunteer with the foundation too, sharing his story at educational seminars about how perpetrators manipulate their victims, how family members can become complicit in abuse, and how healing and accountability were both possible with commitment and work. 2 years after the assault, on what would have been Marcus's 70th birthday, Brandon and I stood in my kitchen, the same kitchen where so many important family moments had happened, and he gave me a gift that brought tears to my eyes, a restored and reframed photograph of the three of us from when he was 10 years old, all of us smiling at the camera with genuine joy and love, a reminder of who we had been and who we could be again. "I can never give you back what I took from you, Mom," Brandon said softly. "I can never undo the hurt I caused or erase the damage to our relationship. But I can promise you that every day for the rest of my life, I will work to be worthy of being your son, worthy of being Dad's son, worthy of the second chance you've given me." I pulled him into a hug, something we had both been too afraid to do until that moment, afraid it would feel forced or empty or wrong. But it felt right. Felt like coming home after a long journey through darkness. Felt like the beginning of something new, built on the ashes of what had been destroyed. "You are my son, Brandon," I said firmly. "You made terrible mistakes. You hurt me deeply, and it took a long time to rebuild trust. But you did the work. You faced what you did wrong. You changed. And that's all any of us can do, is acknowledge our failures and commit to being better." As the sun set through my kitchen window, casting golden light across the room where so much pain and healing had happened, I thought about the journey I had traveled from that moment a slap had shattered my illusions to this moment of hard-won reconciliation. And I understood that the surprise I had waiting for Veronica and Brandon hadn't been just the security cameras or the legal preparation or the strength to fight back, but had been my refusal to let their betrayal define me. My commitment to protecting myself while remaining open to forgiveness. My ability to set boundaries while maintaining love, and my determination to turn trauma into purpose by helping others avoid what I had endured. And as I looked at my son, seeing both the man he had become and the boy he had been, I knew that Marcus would have approved of how I had handled everything, would have been proud of my strength and my compassion and my refusal to become bitter. And I felt at peace in a way I hadn't felt in years. The peace that comes not from avoiding pain, but from walking through it and emerging on the other side stronger, wiser, and still capable of love.